We sit down with the man who famously represented Meek Mill and Bill Cosby on his thoughts regarding the newly unsealed federal indictment against Sean Diddy Combs, charging the music mogul with sex trafficking and racketeering. We bring on Brian J. McMonagle once again. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We're honestly still reeling from the news of the arrest and indictment of Sean Diddy Combs. You know, we knew this was going to happen. We knew it was going to happen. There was reporting for months that the 54-year-old may be the target of a criminal investigation. His homes in LA and Miami, they were raided by federal agents back in March. There was a grand jury in New York that was impaneled. He had been hit with numerous lawsuits alleging sexual assault, sex trafficking, illegal narcotics and gun possession. There were rumors that those alleged victims were cooperating with federal prosecutors. And then last night, it happened. Sean Combs, the music mogul, artist, producer, was arrested out in New York City. Reporting indicates he was taken into custody last night by federal authorities at the Park Hyatt Hotel. He'd actually come to New York in anticipation of the charges. And this comes after a grand jury has indicted him. And that grand jury indictment was unsealed today. A 14-page filing. Damian Williams, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, charged Combs with 3 counts. Racketeering conspiracy, that's the first one. Essentially, that Combs operated a criminal enterprise that engaged in sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice, that they used coercion, threats, physical, sexual violence, guns, drugs to intimidate people, to get them to do what he wanted. And there's a large discussion about freak-offs, when he would allegedly threaten and lure women to engage in sex acts with male commercial sex workers. He's also charged with sex trafficking of a victim by using force or coercion or fraud to have that person engage in commercial sex acts. And he's also charged with transportation of people for purposes of prostitution. And these are 3 very serious felonies that potentially you're looking at potentially 15 years to life in prison. That's what we're talking about here. By the way, as we sort through all these legal filings around Sean Combs, and there's a lot to get into, can I just take a quick second to tell you guys about something positive? Yeah, something that I think you're actually going to really love. Would you want cash back when you buy gas and groceries? Because if you do, that's where our amazing partner and sponsor of Sidebar comes in, Upside. So this is a free app that, honestly, so easy to use. Upside gets you real cash back, money that appears in your Upside app that you can transfer straight into your bank account. Just this weekend, I used Upside to find a gas station. I claimed an offer. I pay with my credit card at the pump, and then I followed the steps on the app to get cash back. It is so simple to use and free, so why not get cash back? And you can use Upside at all different kinds of places, restaurants, convenience stores. So to find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on screen and use our promo code SIDEBAR and you'll get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Hope you can check it out. So with a high-profile case and a high-profile defendant, I want to bring on somebody who knows a thing or two about defending high-profile clients, celebrities. I mean, he famously represented Bill Cosby in his sexual abuse trial, also represented Meek Mill. Let me bring on right now Brian J. McMonagle. Thank you so much for coming on, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So, your reaction, is it what you expected?
You know, it was, and yet reading it took me back a little bit. It's quite stunning that he's been charged with a racketeering crime. You know, when you think of RICO, you think of a lot of things, and you don't usually think of entertainers. But here we go. And it is rather staggering in terms of the accusations. You're talking about sex trafficking, you're talking about kidnapping, forced labor, and the like. And it's going to be a war. The charges couldn't be more serious. My guess is the government will seek pretrial detention, as they often do in cases like this. And he's got a really great lawyer, and he's going to need one.
And we'll get to that pretrial detention because that is what prosecutors are moving forward with. But the racketeering, right? So you have this idea that he is leading this criminal enterprise. It's not like it's Sean Combs LLC, you know, it's a group of people, right? And the idea is that he's using illegal methods to force women and, you know, men as well into these situations. And It's a combination of all of these underlying crimes, but the government is not proving, they don't have to necessarily, they're not charging him with kidnapping or forced labor, but it's an underlying crime, part of this criminal conspiracy. How tough is that to prove? I mean, we know R. Kelly in New York, in the federal context, was charged, was found guilty, sentenced to 30 years in prison. But how tough is that to prove?
You know, RICO has always been an amazing tool for prosecutors, supposedly an easy lift. But when you look at it a little bit more carefully, the first thing they're going to have to prove is a criminal enterprise. Was this really a criminal enterprise, or was this simply a legitimate business that did some pretty despicable things, for lack of a better way to describe it? And the government's got to prove two predicate acts in order for there to be a racketeering conviction. So they've got a high burden of proof, but they've used a statute that time and time again has ensnared a lot of people and convicted a lot of people throughout the country because of its breadth. It is extremely broad, but it is not without limits.
And so talk to me about ways you think that he would defend against this, because these allegations are quite stunning. We dedicated a full episode to breaking down this indictment, but you have everything from this idea of all of these ways that he was using sexual violence and physical violence and intimidation against these people to do what he wanted. And I want to break down something for you. So in this separate letter from the prosecutors to the judge, were they asking for his bail to be denied, or he not be granted pretrial release? I want to list some of the evidence that they say they have, because this indictment, although it's comprehensive, is a little bare bones. So they say the government has conducted interviews with over 50 victims and witnesses, many of whom saw or experienced the defendant's abuse. Many of those witnesses corroborate one another, and their accounts are similarly consistent with the other types of evidence discussed below. The government only expects that number to continue to grow, given that the investigation, which is now public, is ongoing. The electronic evidence is vast. The government has sought and obtained numerous search warrants for such evidence, in addition to obtaining evidence voluntarily from certain victims and witnesses. Setting aside devices seized in connection with the defendant's arrest, the government has obtained over 90 cell phones, laptops, cloud storage accounts, as well as over 30 other electronic and storage devices such as hard drives, thumb drives, cameras, a surveillance system. This electronic data comes from the defendant himself, as well as co-conspirators, victims, witnesses, and chronicles much of the defendant's criminal activity as it occurs. So that feels really tough to defend, but what do you think some ways that you're going to see his defense attorneys fighting back against this?
Yeah, besides that, Mrs. Lincoln, how'd you like to play? It is going to be really difficult to defend. But I think what you're going to see is a rather calculated effort to break it all down. Number one, was he involved in the specific acts? Are there buffers, to use the Godfather analogy? Were these sex workers, or were they victims? Were these people being compensated and paid for their time? Were they voluntarily taking drugs, or were they being drugged? The difference is like the difference between lightning and lightning bug. And, if the defense can find some symmetry in those talking points to say, hey, listen, bad behavior, horrific behavior, but everybody came into this thing with their eyes wide open. They got paid for what they did, and they left compensated. I think that's the only way you can defend it, because the video, particularly the one that we all saw in the hotel, is pretty hard to stomach. And a lot of this stuff is going to be hard to stomach. The seizures that occurred at his multiple homes with, AR-15 assault rifles that have obliterated serial numbers, tough to defend. But I think what you're going to see is, hey, listen, we didn't force anybody to do anything. This was all orchestrated. It was bad behavior. But nobody did anything against their will. And then it's a cross-examination exercise. And they got to hope they get a little bit lucky with one or more of these eyewitnesses in terms of maybe giving false statements or something like that. Otherwise, they're in for a long haul.
Do you get the sense, even though there are no specific alleged victims named in this indictment, and they're not named in the letter as well, Do you get the sense that this indictment is based upon, maybe entirely, the accounts from the people who have already sued him? So Cassandra Ventura, Rodney Jones, Joy Dickerson Neal, he's facing so many different charges, and so many different complaints. Somebody who's been following it for a while, I saw overlap. I mean, more specifically, the Cassandra Ventura 2016 video, which we all know about, which was amplified, which was mentioned by Cassandra Ventura in her complaint, and then we all saw after the CNN published it, and Sean Combs apologized for it. It is mentioned in this indictment. That's a more specific example. There are other things that are more general, but again, it seems to be consistent with the allegations that have been levied against him in these complaints. So do you think that those people who sued him are the cooperating witnesses in this indictment?
There's no question about it. I mean, the federal government doesn't typically need a roadmap, but they got one here. And the civil litigation, I'm sure, consists of the very same players, very same alleged victims, very same witnesses. So they took that and they probably, as you would have imagined, put it in front of a grand jury, got additional witnesses to corroborate that which was, portrayed in the civil litigation. And that's going to be your case. I don't think there's going to be many surprises here for the defense. They've seen this. I think they expected this. And my guess is particularly the way I've seen this charged, it looks like, just as you've discussed, they just took the playbook from the civil litigation and, they put it within the rubric of RICO, and now it's life and death.
And one of the complaints, I believe it was Rodney Jones, alleged RICO violation. So I wasn't surprised to ultimately see that. Were you surprised at the number of counts here, in the sense that, if you compare it to R. Kelly, who I believe was facing more, and there was obvious allegations regarding minors. Here you have a very wide, overarching racketeering charge, and then you have these two other charges: one, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, that is with respect to victim one, and then transportation to engage in prostitution. Why those charges, you think?
Well, they want to be able to establish the predicate crimes. And, like I said, they only need a couple of them. In every RICO I've ever seen, you have the RICO charge, and then you have a laundry list of counts. I was surprised, quite frankly, of the brevity of the complaint. I honestly thought you were going to see a RICO and then about 100 separate counts that a jury would have the ability to return verdicts. So they didn't do that here. It was bare bones, and I'm not so sure it was done without great thought. I don't think they wanted to marry themselves to specific acts just in case they don't have them at the time of trial. I don't know what people have said before the grand jury. And keep in mind, you can only indict by what you presented in front of a grand jury. And so they probably kept it, as simplistic as they could, because juries can get confused, they can get distracted. And then if some of those other counts that you've overcharged go wrong, it could lead to a real problem for the government. So they kept it simple.
That's so interesting. So there is a possibility that more was presented to the grand jury, and the grand jury said there wasn't enough probable cause for these other things you're asking us to come back for, but there is probable cause for these three counts.
Could be that. You could also see a superseding indictment. I've seen that time and time again, where you get the indictment, 2-3 weeks from now, a month from now, they supersede. I don't think they're going to do that here. They took a lot of time.
You mean charge him with additional crimes?
Oh, yeah. They have the ability, probably within the next month or two, to supersede this indictment anytime they wish, quite frankly. I don't think they will. I mean, this is the kind of high-profile case. They gave a lot of thought to this, and they wanted it done this way, and it's going to be a war.
It's interesting you say that, because Damian Williams, the United States Attorney, when he held the press conference today, he said nothing's off the table. Whether that is charging more, that's charging Sean Combs with additional crimes, or charging other people. There's co-conspirators in this. He's the only one charged right now. I don't know if they're cooperating, or he's looking for more to cooperate, or more people will be charged. But he was very clear in the bail package letter, and also when he spoke today, that this is an ongoing investigation. What do you take away from that? Yeah,
I mean, if that's what he said, then look out, because he will be charging other people. I was stunned that other people weren't charged. You always charge as many defendants as you can provide probable cause for. Why? You want them to flip. You want to put pressure on them for their lawyers to say, hey, listen, you're facing a life sentence. You better get on the government's team. So this was really surprising to me. A, because it was just him. B, because of its brevity. So maybe what you're going to see is 2 or 3 more shoes dropping.
Before I get into the idea of bail, how does this case progress? When would you actually see a trial of Sean Combs on these charges, assuming, of course, that there is not a superseding indictment?
I don't know how fast they're moving now in the Southern District, but I assume what will happen here, and what happens in a lot of these RICO cases, is that the government will file or the defense will request a complex case designation. So it'll push this trial out because I'm sure the discovery is voluminous. It'll take months and months. If you're talking about tapes, if you're talking about if there are wiretaps in this case, they'll try and buy time. I could very easily see a trial not for at least 6 months, maybe even 9 months, if it's designated complex case. I don't see anybody running in here and trying this case from the defense perspective. He's got, as I said, really experienced federal lawyers, and they will take their time. They're going to want to read all the grand jury transcripts, develop as much evidence as they can to create doubt, and that's going to take months and months.
What is the complex case designation? What does that mean?
It just means that the discovery is so voluminous that it would take any reasonable defense team to ask for more time. You saw it recently, I think, in some of the Trump prosecutions where the defense was constantly asking for more time to prepare. I mean, a case like this, a RICO case, I've had RICO cases that have taken a year to try, so I wouldn't be surprised if it gets pushed. A lot of it depends on your judge, too. Some judges, like a rocket docket, and they like to move. So, a lot TBD, but I would think it's got to be 6 months out at least.
I want to talk about the circumstances leading to his arrest and indictment. So it was reported that he came to New York, knew that the charges were happening. There's been, I believe, a photograph of him in Central Park. So he was hanging out, again, knowing that this was going to happen, or seemingly knowing this was going to happen. I think it was to make the argument, the same reason I've been asked, how come Combs hasn't just left the country? He knows he's under investigation. Because if you do that, there's a chance you could be arrested, right, immediately. And I think for him, he wanted to say, I'm not a flight risk. And I think he knew he was going to be charged. But I think that for him, if he can say, I came here voluntarily, I've been cooperating, I am not a flight risk, I want bail. And the government I should tell you, the bail package that was offered, they said was insufficient. The bail package that the defense has proposed was home detention with electronic monitoring and a $50 million bond secured by Combs' Miami property. The government says that's insufficient. But I can see, again, I think that he has been trying to do everything these past few months to say, I am not a danger, I'm not a flight risk, and I'm giving you a bail package, but the government says it's insufficient. What do you take away from it?
Proof is in the pudding. That's exactly what they did. I mean, they brilliantly made sure that he came to the jurisdiction voluntarily, that he made himself well known, that he was there, that he cooperated with law enforcement to the extent that he would self-surrender. All of those things will go into the analysis as to whether or not he should be released. My guess is that the bail package that they presented is certainly sufficient. He'll have to surrender his passport. And if he's put on a monitor, they'll know within seconds if he's taken the monitor off. I mean, where's he going to go? It's not that he doesn't have the resources to go other places. He just doesn't have the means, I think, to get there safely if he's under a monitor. So I think the defense really did a brilliant job of really going beyond what they had to. They could have easily said, hey, listen, he's got no prior record. He's been involved in any number of philanthropic activities. He's got a laundry list of folks that'll speak for him. He doesn't need, he could post a bond of $1 million. They went overboard because they know it's a RICO and they know they have a problem. And I think what they submitted, it's going to be hard for a judge to say that's not sufficient, I think.
So in their bail package letter, right, the prosecutors say we have a number of reasons why he should not be let out. They say he's a danger to society, he's a flight risk, the weight of the charges, the weight of the evidence. This is incredibly serious. But then they say that he is engaged in bribing witnesses and obstructing justice. So they talk about how in 2016, with the Cassandra Ventura video of him allegedly beating her in that hallway at a hotel, they say that the defendant tried to bribe a security guard, And it says, after the security guard refused the defendant's bribe, and after coordination between the defendant and his employees, the defendant's staff contacted other members of hotel security. At the same time, staff members were in close communication with the victim of the assault as well, all in an effort to cover up the defendant's assault and to prevent the incident from being publicly disclosed. Within days of the incident, the surveillance video disappeared from the hotel's server. That is actually very consistent with what Cassandra Ventura alleged in her lawsuit. Now, it says, throughout the time period charged in the indictment, members and associates of the enterprise have reached out to multiple victims on behalf of the defendant to convince them not to report the defendant's abuse. Most recently, in late 2023, immediately following public allegations of certain of the defendant's crimes, because we know that he had been hit with a number of lawsuits at that point, including his physical and sexual abuse of women, the defendant and other members of the enterprise made repeated phone calls to victims and witnesses, during which they provided victims and witnesses with false narratives of events in an apparent effort to conceal the defendant's crimes. On at least 2 occasions, the defendant recorded those calls on a co-conspirator's cell phone, thereby attempting to obscure his involvement in the obstruction. That feels like that could be a problem for him in the eyes of the judge.
99% of the cases, if that was alleged in a federal courtroom, it would be enough to hold him. You got to understand there's a statutory presumption that exists with certain crimes. And he really has the burden here, I think, of establishing that there are conditions of release that will protect the public. The one thing that federal judges, all judges hate, is intimidation of witnesses. And if they've got prima facie evidence of witness intimidation, that could be the one thing that keeps him detained prior to trial. You're absolutely right.
I said this before, but I want a little bit of clarification. I looked at the law on this, and I'm reading racketeering conspiracy could be 20 years. I'm looking at sex trafficking using fraud or force or coercion, and if I read it correctly, 15 years minimum to life in prison, I guess depending upon the circumstances. Am I right that this is a situation where if he takes this to trial and he decides to fight it and he loses and he's convicted, he could essentially be looking at the rest of his life in prison?
No question about it. Federal sentencing guidelines and the way the RICO statute is created, it allows a judge to basically say good night.
Because there's a part of it, it's called, and I'm just going to pull it up here one more time. It's part of the racketeering count 1 of this indictment. It calls it the notice of special sentencing factor. And that's what that is?
They'll try and posture this case, depending upon what counts he's convicted of, as a life sentence. Quite frankly, when I first looked at it, I said to myself, if he goes to trial and loses, it's for sure a 25 to life case. So the stakes couldn't be higher. Go to trial in a case like this, you lose, particularly on some of these allegations. There are not many judges in this country that would do anything else but put him in jail for what could be the rest of his life.
One more question for you. We don't have a lot of information in terms of, as I said, like who is cooperating, what this is based off of. But in a federal case like this, maybe in a racketeering case like this, as I said, they're not trying him with forced labor crimes. They're not trying him for kidnapping. They don't have to prove that beyond I guess they have to prove it in order to prove the racketeering case, but he's not being charged with that. There's been a number of people who have asserted claims against him dating back years, so past the statute of limitations on criminal charges, assaults, sexual assaults back from the 90s. Can federal prosecutors use those allegations that might otherwise be time barred in a federal indictment like this?
Sure. Just consider what happened in the Cosby case. Not the trial I had, but the second trial after the hung jury. They tried to introduce evidence of other victims that weren't ever charged. And those crimes were, 20, 30 years old. Federal prosecutors have the same luxury. There's a rule of evidence, as you probably know, Rule 404B, and a judge will have to conduct a balancing test should the government seek to introduce what we call other crimes evidence. And if it is relevant, if it's probative, if it creates a signature, that's really what you would need here. signature crimes that mirror almost hauntingly the crimes charged here. But they've got to, it gets a little difficult when they're older and when they're aged. And in the federal courts, they usually err on the side of caution and not allow a lot of that evidence. But I guarantee you they're going to be trying to introduce it here.
And to be clear, not everything that was alleged in those complaints is a part of this. There was an allegation that he was soliciting minors, and that wasn't a part of this. So I imagine prosecutors were kind of key in what they wanted to use and not.
That really shocked me. I really was surprised that I didn't see any accusations involving minors. I had thought that was going to be the linchpin to this prosecution. So, you're right. If they have that evidence somewhere and witnesses can come in and testify, you may see a superseding indictment on that precisely. Maybe they were protecting child victims, and maybe they just didn't have it. I don't know, but I was really expecting to see that, and that would have been a death knell for him.
Because that's why it was so hard to defend R. Kelly, right? He couldn't say these were sexual, consensual encounters. Here you made an interesting, and to go full circle, if you're talking about defending Sean Combs, you have to tell this jury one day, listen, this is a different environment. This was parties. It's maybe not a party you went to, but it doesn't make it a crime, right? And that's what you'd have to argue. And just to go full circle here, defending a Sean Combs, that is a different kind of beast than defending John Smith, right? When you're defending somebody that high profile, accused of, not every day that somebody would be charged with allegedly engaging in freak-off sessions and having people set up the hotel rooms and bring all the lubricant and all these things. It's really disgusting stuff. So how do you communicate that to a jury one day and say, listen, my client is like anybody else. He's innocent until proven guilty, but he's different, right?
Yeah, defending celebrities is really, really difficult. Put Simpson aside for a second. It really is a difficult chore, particularly when you have to swallow the obvious here. He's acting horribly. He's on videotape, beating women up. You've got firearms. You've got drugs. You've got horrific behavior. Juries don't empathize with people that make millions and billions of dollars getting away with stuff. So it's a difficult case for people who have that kind of wealth and money and opportunity to live a decent life. So juries, at least in my experience, again, put Simpson aside for a second because that was a murder case and that was, maybe he didn't do it. But when you've got bad conduct like this and they're a celebrity, it's not a fun place to be.
And look, I would say, just to end with this, it's exciting from a legal point of view to see how this progresses. There's a number of different legal issues, but I read these cases from the very beginning, and these allegations are horrific. And I said this before when I was on air, that this is a step for the victims in this case, or the witnesses in this case, or the alleged victims. This is, they would say, a step in the right direction, right? But this also has to be really tough for them, because now they might have to testify. This is being amplified, and this is not going to be easy for the people who were involved. This is a reason why a lot of people don't come forward. I mean, Damian Williams was asked, how come he was never charged before? Well, maybe people didn't feel comfortable coming forward before. And look, Sean Combs is innocent until proven guilty. But if these allegations are true, I also have to think how difficult this must be for the people who are involved.
I couldn't put it any better. Put it any better. As has been said many times, for real legitimate victims, sometimes they're raped a second time at a trial. So,
there you go.
Stay well.
Brian, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
It's going to be exciting. Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.